Hi everybody, I'm Miss Jennifer at the Leach Library. I'm the children's librarian here. Today we will be reading a story that I'm glad you joined me for. It's called Clarence Henry, the Hermit Crab. And we would like to say thank you to the author, Janice Spina, for allowing us to read this to you today. And also a special thank you to John Spina, the illustrator. So, let's get started with our fun story. Again, it's called Clarence Henry, the Hermit Crab. Clarence Henry is a hermit crab who lives in an 80-gallon saltwater tank with many other creatures of the sea. This right here is Clarence Henry. Clarence Henry poked his head out, looking all around and about. He saw several fish in his new home, but he did not feel safe yet to roam. He came to his new home from a pet store. Clarence Henry is very different, as you can see, but that doesn't stop him from doing everything a crab can do and more. All day long he says, I must clean this tank or bust. Clarence Henry has 6 legs, 4 on his left and 2 on the right side. He also has no right front claw, though it doesn't seem to hurt his pride, and to have fewer appendages, there is no law. All day long he says, I must clean this tank or bust. Since the time Clarence Henry lost his claw, he learned to be aware that when you are different, others do stare. Clarence Henry's parents taught him that to be all that a hermit crab should be, that no tank is too big, and that Clarence Henry should use all his legs to move, forage, and dig. All day long he says, I must clean this tank or bust. The shell he has on his back requires, in order to move, quite a knack. The sound you hear are clickety-clack. As Clarence Henry grows bigger, he will need to find a new shell. If he doesn't, he will not be able to move very well. He says, I must clean this tank or bust. Now, Clarence Henry sits in his new water world. He is a little nervous as all the different fish swim by him. The water bubbles all around him, and they do swirl. Clarence Henry knows he needs to keep the fish from getting too close to him. This fish is kind of close, isn't it? Clarence Henry stays much to himself, always keeping busy. He has an important job to do. His legs and claw move so fast, they can make you dizzy. Clarence Henry's job is essential to the lives of all the fish in the tank too. All day long he says, I must clean this tank or bust. The fish all appreciate what Clarence Henry can do. Keeping the fish tank clean and clear is very important to all. It is true. The fish no longer have anything to fear because Clarence Henry is always near. All day long he says, I must clean this tank or bust. Clarence Henry is still quite shy. In his own shell he does live. He has gotten to know some of the neighbors as they swim by. A wave of his claw is an acknowledgement he does give. All day long he says, I must clean this tank or bust. As Clarence Henry moves around, on his back he carries his home, which is his shell. When he moves, his shell scrapes along the tank, causing a clicking sound. Clarence Henry has learned to climb up and down the rocks very well. All day long he says, I must clean this tank or bust. The human who watches over the tank drops fresh food each day. The fish have him to thank for all the delicious food that comes their way. Clarence Henry is having a tough time getting around. He has grown very large for his shell. He can't climb as he has previously with a bound. Today, Clarence Henry is not feeling well. All day long he says, I must clean this tank or bust. Clarence Henry's movements are becoming sluggish and slow. He knows it is time to molt. This means Clarence Henry casts off his old skin so that the new one can grow. The old skin will come off with a jerk and a jolt. All day long he says, I must clean this tank or bust. The human has noticed Clarence Henry's uncomfortable state. For Clarence Henry, he has dropped in a gift, hoping that he is not too late. This new shell will give Clarence Henry's spirit a much needed lift. Clarence Henry has spied the item floating down as round as a bell. He hurries over to it to claim his new home. Now Clarence Henry is feeling just swell, and he can once again happily roam. Clarence Henry has found his new shell, and now that he is molted, he fits in it very well. Clarence Henry happily says, I must clean this tank or bust. But what do we see? Is that Clarence Henry? Could it be? Poking his head out of his new shell, he's looking dashing and quite well. It is clear that Clarence Henry has grown a new leg and claw, but he is still the same hermit crab, and to have his new appendages, there is no law. Clarence Henry says with gusto, I must clean this tank or bust. The fish are swimming around with a bound, greeting and congratulating him. They miss Clarence Henry being around. Now the fish can go about their way in a clean tank in which they can once again swim. Clarence Henry will never have to look for a new space. This hermit crab has finally found his own special place. The end. So this was a cool story because I was remembering back to when I was growing, and sometimes I did get really tired and I didn't feel great, and sometimes my arms and my legs would hurt if I was growing really fast, and maybe for some of you that's happening now too. So it's not unusual for animals to feel the same way. So if you're feeling that way, you might be a little bit like Clarence Henry. So there are some interesting things I learned about hermit crabs. Did you know that some people, just like in this book, have hermit crabs in fish tanks that they keep as pets? You can sometimes see them at the pet store, and they move around just a little bit at the bottom of the tank. They very rarely leave their shells, usually only to get a new shell, because their shells really protect them from predators and other things that might be in the water with them. So they really like to stay inside their shell as much as they possibly can. Another very interesting thing I thought, and I did not know this at all, is that hermit crabs have a bigger right claw than left claw, and their right claw is always bigger. And one other thing that goes along very well with the story is that if a hermit crab can not find a bigger shell, which they will just sort of roam around the ocean floor until they find one. They don't, in the wild, they don't have somebody drop a shell in their tank for them, so they have to go looking for a bigger shell. But if they can't find one and they're starting to outgrow their shell, sometimes they can molt off enough of their skin so that they can still fit inside their old shell. So they won't be quite as uncomfortable as Clarence Henry was when he was looking for a new shell and waiting and hoping to get one. So that is our story for today. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you again for joining us.